Welcome to the Chrisman Commentary Daily Mortgage News Podcast. I'm your host, Robbie Chrisman. Topics on today's episode include reverberations from Friday's week payrolls report, my interview with Polunsky Beitel Marty on Fed Governor Cook's timeline for recourse in the courts over her recent firing and various other political happenings as we approach next week's FOMC meeting. And looking ahead to this week's economic calendar, which includes CPI and PPI. Thanks to today's podcast sponsor, Indicom. Indicom combines mortgage AI, intelligent automation, machine learning, and intelligent document processing with mortgage operational expertise to ensure that every solution is accurate, scalable, and impactful as it is innovative. Indicom's AI-powered tools, like Income Genius, Decision Genius, and IDX Genius AI, aren't off-the-shelf solutions. They're tailored and purpose-built for mortgage operations, trained on vast mortgage datasets, and refined by the feedback of operations teams, underwriters, and QC professionals. This practical focus means faster implementations, fewer errors, and a much shorter time to value. When the economy is good, people drink. When the economy is bad, people drink. The moral? Invest in alcohol. Here in Boise at the Pacific Northwest Mortgage Lenders Conference, the comments about Friday's jobs data showing a worsening employment picture ranged from, "It's about time we have accurate numbers that we can rely upon," to, "The Trump administration is still blaming the people compiling the numbers as opposed to the actual policies." Like if you had an NFL owner who just lost big and instead of changing the quarterback or firing the coach, they axed the scoreboard operator. Given the slowing job market, President Trump will likely get that Fed interest rate cut he's been advocating for. Some analysts are even betting on a 50 basis point cut. MBA SVP and Chief Economist Mike Fratantoni had a reaction to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics report on employment conditions in August. Quote, "The job market is softening, even with sectors like healthcare, which had steadily contributed to job growth, now slowing. Job losses continued in the federal government and manufacturing sectors. Wage growth at 3.7% over the past year is steady, but it is certainly running at a slower pace than a year ago. While the headline unemployment rate increased to 4.3%, what was more notable was the larger increase in the U6 to 8.1%, with more workers only able to find part-time work or becoming discouraged by the lack of job openings, and the continued increase in length of unemployment spells. While the pace of layoffs has picked up somewhat, the hiring rate remains quite low. It's increasingly difficult for those laid off and for new entrants into the job market to find a position. The slowdown in the job market should be more than enough for the FOMC to cut its short-term rate at its September meeting, as it is not a picture of an economy at maximum employment, and the greater risk now appears to be that the job market will slip further in the months ahead. The pace of additional cuts will certainly be tempered by the ongoing risk of a pickup in tariff-induced inflation." End quote. New revisions to prior months' job figures also raised red flags. While July's numbers actually jumped from 73,000 jobs added to 79,000, June's job numbers, which originally showed a job gain of 14,000, were updated to a loss of 13,000. This marks the first time that the U.S. economy has lost jobs in nearly 4 years. Remember a few years ago when unemployment hovered at half-century lows? Now it's at its highest point since the depths of the pandemic. Given the shift in focus from inflation to employment, the current labor environment gives the Fed the room it needs to ease monetary policy. Markets have fully priced in a 25 basis points rate cut following the next FOMC meeting on September 17th, and expectations have shifted from an additional cut to 2 more cuts before the end of the year for a 2025 total of 75 basis points of easing. For those who care about interest rates, following the jobs report, 10-year Treasury yield dipped below 4.10% for the first time since April, briefly testing the upward trend line connecting prior low yield points. If yields push below 4.06%, there's little technical support until 4%. Meanwhile, 30-year Treasury yields also fell, breaching their 200-day moving average for the first time since April, with momentum favoring further declines. Resistance lies near 4.75%. Despite the recent rally, investor sentiment is skewing bearish. For today's interview, I want to welcome back to the show Polunsky Beitel Marty to talk about Fed Governor Cook's timeline for recourse in the courts over her recent firing, and various other political happenings as we approach next week's FOMC meeting. He's principal at Polunsky, Beitel Green and brings more than 30 years of high-level experience in legal banking and financial services industries to his client engagements. He's admitted to practice before all Texas state and federal district courts in addition to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit.
I think that there's too many talking heads in mortgage, and I'm probably guilty of being one of them. But this, oh, Trump's hinging on the Fed's independence. Oh, the Fed's late to cutting rates. Those are kind of worn out at this point, and so I want to take it to the next level. I think there's an old adage that people of great minds talk about ideas, people of average minds talk about events, and people of mediocre minds talk about people. So I'm a mediocre mind, and we're going to start by talking about Fed Governor Cook here a little bit. Can you take us through, from a legal perspective, these court challenges? And maybe I should back up a little bit. When your boss says you're fired, normally you're fired. She hasn't vacated her post? Can you talk about kind of the
Well,
dynamics of?
yeah, that it's an interesting thing. I guess the question is if the boss does not have the authority to fire you, are you really fired? That's the question that she's trying to raise in the courts. The interesting thing about it is that he unquestionably has the ability and the authority to fire her. The question is, has he done it for cause under the statute or not? And if he hasn't done it for appropriate cause, is it still effective? There could be an argument that even if it's unlawful, he still fired her and she's still unable to serve as a result of that. She may have recourse in the courts as to I've been inappropriately terminated, but that does not mean that she has not been terminated. That would be the argument that the administration will be making. The counter argument from her side is that in order to maintain the independence of the Fed that you mentioned, it is important that they not be fired without cause, and that you can't maintain that independence if you give him the authority to do that, where even if it's wrongful. So that's sort of the two sides of the argument. How the courts come out, it's as yet to be seen with respect to it. What's interesting about it is all of this is in the backdrop of a meeting coming up next
Yeah,
week.
is she going to show up to the meeting? Like, what's going to happen here?
I don't know exactly, but my suspicion might be that she is able to attend the meeting because there are people who are not members of the Fed who are in the meeting, right? And so, for just continuity's sake, in the event that she was to be reinstated, it might make some sense that she attend the meeting, but not necessarily participate in the decision making with respect to the Fed. And my guess is, if it's still unresolved by then, that would not be an untenable position for the Fed and for her to take with respect to that. And that would probably be the one that sort of maintained the status quo to the extent possible and make some sense.
Let's talk about this from a legal perspective of how it progresses from here, and kind of timeline of appealing and how it'll work. Like,
Mhm.
is this going to be a Supreme Court case? And if so, how long will it take to get there? What's the timeline of all this playing out?
I think that one of the things about it is that it will probably work on an accelerated timeline just because of the importance of the issues, and the whoever loses will want this to be expedited. And so, to the extent that she is successful at getting reinstated by a court, that will immediately get appealed to another court, and there's always the possibility that the Supreme Court could take it without it necessarily going through the intermediate stage, just on an expedited sort of request because of the importance of the issue and the uniqueness of it. Unusual to see that. I would not anticipate seeing that, but you could have them weigh in before the appeals court. But I think they'd let it run its course, but it would happen probably on an expedited calendar. Soonest you would see anything resolved on this, though, is still probably going to be the year end or the first part of next year.
Do you have thoughts, or I guess I'm asking you to give your opinion on how you see this playing out when it eventually gets to the Supreme Court? Because on one hand, the Supreme Court has ruled along Donald Trump's preferred lines a lot recently. However,
Uh-huh.
this court has set the precedence of the Fed operates on a more independent level than other federal
Right.
agencies, and so kind of you see that tug of war. People can see that tug of war. How do you expect it to play out?
Well, I do think that you're going to see that tension there because, as you've correctly pointed out, the Supreme Court's gone out of their way in some ways to sort of support the administration in ruling that there is certainly administrative power based upon the constitutional analysis that they've done. But they've also said other agencies are not quite like the Fed. And so they've kind of made the Fed it sort of be special in their own eyes. And then the question here is, does the firing of Lisa Cook really do they look at that differently than they do other things? Now, the question here is, I guess, well, there's multiple questions, I guess, with respect to her. One is what she did it in terms of the mortgages that she had here? Does that arise to a level of something that would happen, would cause you to be fired, particularly because it's not related to her job? It's tangential to it, but the counter argument that the administration will be making is that, look, someone who can't be trusted to be honest about their mortgage can't be trusted to be honest with the American people about what the right interest rate path might be. And so that would be the argument that the administration will be making. But it is a little bit unusual that what you see is a firing for cause when the cause literally doesn't have anything related to do with anything that happened even while she was a Fed governor. It was really something that happened before. And so that would be the argument that she's going to be making, is that doesn't constitute cause. And if you truly believe that the Fed is independent, you can't allow this to continue, because if the president can fire her for this, he can fire everyone else, and the independence is gone at that point.
Yes, it's obvious that the Trump administration is turning over every stone they can to see what levers they can pull at the
Right.
Fed. I wonder longer term, Trump has built a business empire. Obviously, he inherited some stuff from his father, but he's built his own empire, and you would think that he understands the role of free markets and those sorts of things, and the value of independence, and what we've seen from other countries when they start to get into their central bank happenings, or sorry, these strong men get into their central bank happenings. You see inflation shoot way up. There's negative consequences, and so I don't think Jerome Powell's done a great job. I think he made monetary policy too easy back during COVID, and that got us to where we are now with housing, lack of affordability in America. And now he's scarred from that, and he's been a little too late to cut rates, in my opinion. And we're seeing the labor market kind of rapidly, rapidly deteriorate.
Mhm.
And so I don't think he's done a great job. But the last thing I want is for the Fed not to be an independent institution. So it's tough here.
I think that you're right in a lot of ways, and I think that Donald Trump does understand the importance of the independence of the Fed. And if Joe Biden was in control of the Fed, he'd really want them to be independent. But he also wants them to sort of
Yeah.
adopt policy that's more in line with what he thinks is appropriate at the time, which is not that unusual. So I do think there's a little bit of duality in terms of how he thinks about that. I think that at the end of the day, where what you've kind of mentioned about the deterioration of the employment market and other things that are happening in the economy sort of make it pretty clear that I think they're going to cut interest rates next week, and that they're probably going to be cutting interest rates perhaps at the next several meetings, which certainly makes the independence of the Fed, disturbing that, less important, because you're getting most of what you want. Now, you may not be getting it on the same pace that he would like, but I suspect that the movement here is going to be completely in the direction of interest rate cuts for the next several months. And then by May of next year, you're going to have a new chairman of the Fed anyway. So you only really have a handful of meetings that we're talking about here in terms of what they're doing. And I think that the economic case for them doing what the president wants is becoming clearer and clearer with each of these reports. So I think that they're going to get an alignment just by the data sort of lining up with what he wants.
Yeah. Well, the other question hanging over the Fed is, when 2026 comes around and it's time to approve members, how many governors will have been appointed by Trump? Will he have 4 of 7 appointed and have control in a sense? And the irony of all this with Lisa Cook, she was one of the most dovish Fed members historically. And it's like you're getting rid of one of the doves, not the hog. It's weird to kind of see that dynamic.
Well, it's interesting watching. I'll just sort of toss this out. It was really interesting watching Stephen Myron's confirmation hearing in front of.
He said he was going to still serve under the president in a different capacity, and
Well, yeah. What he's doing is that it's interesting, because this is a really weird appointment, because it's only through January of next year, so it's really a short stub period. So what he said is that he would want to take a leave of absence from serving the president in terms of the chairman of the economic advisors, with the idea that if it's only for this 4 months, he would come back to the original role. Now, I question whether or not you're going to go through all the political gyrations of getting him on for 4 months with the idea of not reappointing him. That seems kind of odd to me. If you were going to appoint someone else 4 months from now, why not go ahead and appoint them now? So that was a little bit unusual in terms of that. But yeah, I think it raised an issue about, well, is he really under the thumb of the president if he's intended to go back? I think the Republicans made a decent argument that, look, whoever the Donald Trump appoints at this phase is probably going to be pretty aligned with what he wants to do. So are we making a mountain out of a molehill in terms of him keeping that optionality out there?
Well, can Stephen Miran be re-upped come next year?
He could. He could. Yeah, he could.
I guess that the argument there would be, well, if we install him now, it's going to be a lot easier to keep him around later on. So we need
no question. And I think that would be what I would anticipate happening. Because again, I don't see why you would use the political capital and all of that, because it would be a reasonably easy reappointment if he's reappointed in January.
Yeah. Let's talk ideas. We'll graduate from people to events to ideas. Go in reverse here. The pendulum swing that we've seen to the right. Obviously, that's what Trump was elected to do. Has he swung so far right for the sake of he knows eventually there will be another Democrat administration that pushes it back left? Or is he swinging so far to the right because that's what he thinks is the proper course for America?
I think his sense is that this is a movement that has more longevity to it. And so he's swinging it there because that's what he thinks his constituency wants. And that's the direction that he sort of sees for the country. And if it ultimately a Democrat is elected and you end up swinging back, then obviously you're swinging from a better place. That would be, I think, the mindset that he and those around him would probably have. But I don't think it's really the political piece of it is the policy one that they're more concerned about.
Well, you could argue that the nation is shifting that way in a lot of senses. I read some article about how the Electoral College, the way that it's getting redistricted, and subsequent ones, is going to make the path to the White House a lot harder for Democrats. And that's people voting with their feet in a way. If a bunch of people leave New York to go to Florida or leave California to go to Texas, there's gonna be more Electoral College votes in places that people want to be politically speak. Is that, you're kind of looking at me quizzically here, but
well, no, I think there's probably some truth to that. I guess the counter argument might be, and this is again just counter argument would be that if someone moves from California to Texas, does Texas become a little less solidly red as a consequence of that? And so at some point, that's what ends up happening. Now, one could also argue, and this is, and I think there's some truth to this, is the Californians that are moving to Texas are not because they're wanting to. I mean, they like the political climate better, they like the economic climate, and other things like that. So I do think that migration is causing a greater concentration in certain areas. And so you're absolutely right that electoral map may be more favorable for Republicans, at least based upon where things currently stand now. What we also know is that people's allegiance to one party or the other in terms of that middle piece of the electorate is a lot more pliable than and so they swing from one election to the other, and they have in the past. The question is are they getting more entrenched with one party or the other where they feel more of an identity there? And if that happens, then I think you very well could see it be a harder path for the Democrats going forward.
I'll throw my 2 cents in here, and I will say that I do think the nation's obviously becoming more polarized on the ends, but that pendulum swing that I was talking about with Trump, the left has swung so far left and the right has swung so far right, it's become that middle ground is now a lot more capturable in a lot of ways. These people that swing election to election, they're like, just give me somebody that comes back toward what I as a moderate view as like a more common sense thing, and I'll vote for them. And I think you've seen here, at least I guess Gavin Newsom's the Democratic favorite for 2028. He's started to have some more centrist policies, if you will, in California. The homeless encampments come to mind. And so, kind of playing this populist card to prepare yourself to try and win some of that moderate electorate's an interesting play.
You're right. I think that the Democrats have sort of looked at some of those wedge issues, if you will, and decided those aren't really things to die on your sword about, frankly, and that if you want to win elections, you better be a little bit more realistic about some of those issues, because most people do not want the homeless in their neighborhood. That doesn't mean necessarily they want them in a prison or anything like that. So there's probably something sensible with respect to that, but not letting that get out of hand is probably something that would benefit the Democrats in terms of future elections, because past elections have proven that people look at that and say, you don't care about me because all you care about is the homeless people, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Especially because if Gavin Newsom is the front runner, the nation just said, I don't like a California Democrat in Kamala. And then, boom, the Democratic Party is going to potentially run another California Democrat. We'll see how that plays out. There hasn't been a president from California since Reagan in the 80s. I mean, the West Coast. There hasn't even been a West Coast president since Reagan in the 80s. So,
right.
Not the most popular thing right now.
Well, I was going to say a couple other things. I think that it's interesting looking at the meeting coming up this week is that if you look back the minutes of the last meeting, obviously one thing that was really unusual, Robbie, that we haven't really talked about yet is the fact that you had not one but two governors who actually dissented, which hadn't happened since 1993. So it's been over 30 years. I mean, that's one of the things about the Fed is that they really like working where they have a consensus, and they pretty much try to present themselves as in unanimity with respect to the decision. And sort of the protocol is that unless you feel very, very strongly, you don't dissent. You kind of vote with the chair here. And so that was kind of interesting to see that. What was also interesting is that obviously one of the people who dissented was Michelle Bowman, and the other one was Chris Waller, yes. But Bowman actually dissented back in September of 24 when they cut it a half point. So she was actually on the other side of that cut, saying she thought it was too precipitous, but now she says they're late in the game on this side around. So it's kind of interesting that directionally she's dissenting on different sides of what the decision is. Now, she may have been right in both instances.
I know, and I like flexible people. So good.
Yeah. So I'm okay with that, but she was appointed by Donald Trump, and then the September cut of a half point was pretty close to the election, and so some people who are skeptics would probably argue that was more politically motivated, perhaps, than it needed to be, and that a quarter point would have been more judicious at the time. But it's going to be interesting to see with that. So you have just a really weird meeting coming up because you have the potential to have a new member with Steve Myron coming on. You have the potential of Lisa Cook not participating at all because of her ostensibly at least being fired. And then you have two dissenters from the last meeting. And then you have on top of that, the data sort of lining up for a cut. So it's really interesting, going to be an interesting meeting to see the minutes for, and it's going to be a real interesting meeting to see what the decision is. I think the decision is going to be to cut rates. But the question is will they do it more than a quarter point?
Yes. And I think currently odds are around 15% of a 50 basis point cut.
Right.
Some sort of cut fully priced in at this point, especially after August payrolls coming in weaker than expected. There's two interesting things that I'll add on top of that listeners of this podcast probably understand, but the general public might not. And that is one, Jerome Powell doesn't set rates. There's a FOMC voting committee. There's a huge committee here of voting members. And so Chair Powell hasn't lowered rates. Well, this hasn't been the case, but say he wanted to lower rates and the rest of the committee doesn't, they're not lowering rates. So saying too late Jerome all the time is like, he's not responsible. And the other thing is the Fed doesn't set mortgage rates. And so the general public says the Fed's cutting rates, mortgage rates. That's not how it works. It's the front end of the yield curve. And actually, since they started cutting rates last September, mortgage rates haven't really budged. We've seen a little dip here recently, but they
actually went up.
Yeah,
they actually went up in response to it, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that was it. The joke was around the sort of the bar was that you don't ask them to lower rates anymore because rates are just going to keep going up on the long in terms of mortgage rates. Now, I think that they have historically moved more in tandem with what the Fed's doing, and I think that given some of the weakness that we've seen on the employment side, the likelihood of that sort of shifting and working more along that same way is probably more likely. But you're absolutely right. There's not necessarily a correlation that they have to do that at all, for sure.
Well, the CPI and PPI reports this week will be telling in terms of, hey, was the Fed wrong about it having this outsized impact? And also, an appellate court just ruled against the constitutionality of Trump's tariffs.
Right.
It got pushed out to September 16th. Ton of uncertainty. And you think that if we get some more certainty on if they're legal or not, and then that they're not going to raise inflation, you'll see longer term rates come down. Because with all the inflation uncertainty or expectations right now, that's what's kept longer term rates on the yield curve elevated.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
All right, so I alluded to this. I'm going to end with a personal question because we have a long-standing relationship at this point. At what age would your parents have said, "I knew Marty was going to be a lawyer," and why?
Well, probably when I was arguing with them as a 9th and 10th grader, that they thought that was a career that I should probably pursue. So it was fairly early on that I thought that might be a career path for me. So that's probably it was not something that came as a surprise when I got to college. That's for sure.
There you go. Well,
Yeah.
for people that enjoyed this discussion, I always enjoy talking to Marty. But for more Marty, tune into Mortgage Law Today, presented by Polunsky, Beitel, Green next week. I believe that's September 16th. At noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. Good stuff there. Good stuff today. Thank you for the time, sir.
Appreciate it. Always a pleasure. Thanks, Robbie.
Don't assume that this week's consumer price and producer price combination has the potential to materially reprice the U.S. rates market, as investor bias lies toward weakness on the labor front. Investors are looking for an August increase of 0.3% in month-over-month core CPI, comparable to July's move. However, there is a risk of a repeat of July's composition. That is, soft goods inflation with sticky services pressure. Even in the event of an upside inflation surprise, the FOMC is surely going to follow through with a 25 basis points cut on September 17th. This week's data includes key inflation updates, that's the aforementioned CPI as well as PPI, along with consumer credit, wholesale inventories, the budget statement, and Michigan sentiment. Treasury will conduct the mini refunding tomorrow to Thursday, consisting of $58 billion of 3-year notes, $39 billion of reopened 10-year notes, and $22 billion of reopened 30-year bonds. No Fed speakers are scheduled, since the Fed will be in blackout ahead of next week's FOMC meeting. However, the ECB will be out with its latest decision on Thursday, where it's expected to hold rates steady. For MBS, Class A 48 hours is on Friday. Today's economic calendar kicks off later this morning with the Employment Trends Index for August, and will be followed by consumer credit for July and some short-duration Treasury auctions. We begin the week with agency MBS prices unchanged from Friday's elevated levels, the 2-year yielding 3.50 after closing last week at its lowest level in 3 years, as the market's expectations for a 25 basis point rate cut were cemented, and the 10-year yielding 4.09 after closing last week at 4.09%, a level last seen in early April. Let's wrap up with a joke and some housekeeping. Experience is something you don't get until just after you need it. But thanks again to this week's sponsor, Indicom. Streamlining operations with the genius blend of automation, AI, and services, Indicom helps you achieve practical digital transformation and real operational impact with purpose-built mortgage solutions. To learn more, visit Indicom, that's INDECOMM.com.